Hello and welcome. I'm Praveer Malik, and today I'm going to offer some musings on light. So, why light? If we think about matter that exists anywhere, it's constituted by atoms. So, whether it's animate matter or inanimate matter, fundamentally it's made of atoms, and these atoms have all been forged in the light of the suns of the stars or in the math of a supernova. And so by definition, every single atom has a deep signature of light inside it. In other words, anything that we see or that we are has massive amounts of light inside it. But even if we were to think about our context and our position in that context, our orientation in life is provided, in a sense, by light streaming in to our eyes from objects that might be far or near. And this light gets processed in our brains and, in a sense, grounds us into a massive light-based operating system. Further, if we think about any living beings, then the nutrition of all living beings can trace its origin to a process of photosynthesis, which again relies on the light of the sun. So it's fair to say that without light, we wouldn't exist. But even if we think about the current moment, a lot of the technologies that we take for granted are based on what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, which is nothing other than light. And even if we extrapolate into the future, it's been said that it's optics and quanta that's going to drive a lot of what's possible technologically in the future. And therefore, our past, our current, and our future is heavily dependent on light. And yet, in a sense, we barely think about it. So here I'm going to offer musings on light. And this is based on a book by this name, Musings on Light, which was published earlier in 2022, so just a couple of months ago. But this book itself has been written at the end of a journey, and this journey was one in which I articulated the power of light through a mathematics written in 10 volumes of cosmology of light. So first of all, what got me interested in light? Now, there's several streams, but I'll share one, and it goes back to me working in organizational development and in the business world way back in the 90s. And what really got my interest back then was, what is it that really creates resilience in the system or the sustainability in the system, regardless of whether it's an economic system or an organizational system. And so I was led into trying to understand this sustainability and resilience from an organizational perspective. And as a result, I wrote a series of 3 books in which I elaborated fractal dynamics, which connected essentially small patterns to what was happening in the system or larger system itself. But the more important thing was that this study or this urge to understand resilience led me into the notion of, okay, what is it that creates resilience in biological systems or in chemical systems or in physical systems? And that really is what led me into light. So light being, in a sense, the origin of physical systems, so physical systems emerging from there, and then subsequently chemical systems emerging from that, and biological systems emerging from chemical systems, and so on. So one can trace the origin of everything that's emerged from light itself And that's what really led me into a study of what light is. So why is it a cosmology of light? Essentially, I call it a cosmology because the idea is that light, as we know it in the physical universe, is scientifically moves at a speed of 186,000 miles per second, and it's a constant speed. But what if light could exist at different constant speeds? What kinds of realities might it create? And what would be the interaction of these different realities in affecting how things showed up physically? And that's really what drove the idea of a cosmology. Now, the 10 books were essentially pretty heavy in a sense, and I would say unapproachable, or perhaps appeal to a small audience. And so I partnered with Margaret Faines, who's an artist in Lodi, so close to the Bay Area. And we collaborated on this book, Musings on Light, which essentially the idea was to take 50 core principles or ideas from the 10 cosmology of light books and summarize them in a way that would become easier for people to grasp and get the sense of what a cosmology of light is. So that really is what Musings on Light is. And I'm going to, in the next 40 minutes or so, share several of these images and also trace out what I'd call a story of light based on these images. So if we start with a thought experiment, and imagine you're looking out on the horizon and the sun is rising, it's the morning time, and you know it would take about 8.5 minutes for the light from the sun to reach you on the earth. And now imagine that you're on a ray of light that's halfway on that journey. So as you look back at the sun, you get a sense that you were there approximately 4.5 minutes in the past. As you look at the earth, you'll get a sense that that you'll be there in approximately 4.5 minutes. And so the notion of time arises because you're currently in the middle experiencing some present, and this time has arisen because of the way light is traveling. By contrast, if light were traveling infinitely fast, then everything would be experienced here and now. But because of its finiteness, this notion of past, present, and future arise. But also what arises is the idea of matter or the reality of matter, because if by definition we know that light in the physical universe is traveling at a finite speed, then assuming that there is something that light is trying to convey, or assuming that some concept that is hidden by light and is to be expressed by light, because of its finiteness, it's going to take a certain amount of time and distance to express itself. And this time and distance can be related to a notion of a packet or a quanta. And this idea of a quanta then offers some stability to that concept that's trying to materialize. And in a sense, that can be thought of as the basis of matter. So we're seeing that because of the way light is traveling, for very fundamental things that we experience in the physical universe, the past, present, future, and matter seem to be related to it. So I'm going to come back to this notion of four, and perhaps I'll go into the symmetries of the four depending on how this flow goes. But the idea of light creating fundamental experiences based on the way it's traveling, that really is the takeaway from this idea of emergence of time and matter. Now let's think of another thought experiment where light is traveling infinitely fast. So because it's traveling infinitely fast, we could say that it's going to be present in whatever volume is considered instantaneously. So there's going to be a reality of omnipresence. We could say that anything that arises or disappears is going to be recorded in this fabric of light. And so light is going to have an instantaneous knowledge of everything that's happening in its quote unquote space. And therefore it's all knowledgeable or omniscient. Now, if anything not of the nature of light were to arise, then it would ultimately be overpowered by light. And so we can say that there's a property of omnipotence or all power that arises. And since by definition, everything is connected in the one fabric of light, there's going to be a property or a principle of omninurturance or implicit harmony that exists. And so we see that there are four fundamental properties that seem to emerge, again, when light is traveling infinitely fast. And to summarize, these are omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omninurturance. And we can perhaps simplify that by just thinking of these as presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. Now, in a cosmology of light, the idea is that the native state of light is where it travels infinitely fast. And because it's characterized by omniscience, omnipotence, omninurturance, omnipresence, there's essentially an infinite amount of information that exists in it. And when light projects itself at slower speeds, as it does when it travels at 186,000 miles per second, then some of that information that exists in its native state begins to get materialized. So there's a progressive materialization of that information where what is inside light reveals itself to us in a different way and becomes more tangible as an object based on how light is traveling. So if we take at least these two scenarios where light is traveling infinitely fast and then light travels at 186,000 miles per second, the known speed, we've already explored very briefly how the realities are going to be different. And these realities are going to be based on the information that's in light, but also it's possible to conceive of different constant speeds of light that create different kinds of information. And I'll mention as well that if light were to project itself at zero speed, then essentially it would not be able to travel or express itself in any way. And so that reality that would be created would be fundamentally a different kind of reality, the opposite in a sense, were light to travel infinitely fast. So instead of omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omninurturance, we would have extreme fragmentation, complete weakness, complete ignorance, and complete disharmony. So there would be, in a sense, perhaps what we may even term as a dark hell or something of that nature. So essentially, what the picture that begins to emerge is that there's symmetry. So what is symmetry? Symmetry is essentially that phenomena where some reality can express itself or show itself in a different way based on how it's perceived. So if we consider that light in its native state has these four properties that we're just roughly calling presence, power, knowledge, harmony, then as light projects itself at slower and slower speed, it's these same four properties that again express themselves, but they express themselves such that they appear different. It's a different face of that same thing. So when we consider, for example, light traveling at 186,000 miles per second, then we have that symmetrical reality where at least we notion these four fundamental notions appear or arise, the notions of past, present, future, and harmony. If we really think about what each of these, the past, present, future, and matter, if we think about what they stand for, then you can perhaps say that when we look out around us, so whether we are sitting in an office or out in nature, we'll see that everything that exists around us is the result of a tremendous amount of activity that's taken place in the past. And in that activity, there's a presence. And so, in a sense, whatever the past is may be related with this notion of presence. When we think about the present moment, then we can become aware that there's many different forces that are vying for expression. And it's perhaps the most powerful force, the stronger force, however we want to define that strongness, that will express itself. And so there's the present moment that, in a sense, is correlated with this idea of power. When we think about the future, there's an inevitability to some kinds of ideas that will express itself. And so we can say that the future becomes a carrier, in a sense, of light's property of knowledge. And then when we think about matter, then matter is allowing many different stable entities to arise within our field and become the basis of a massive progressive harmony. And so we can say that matter, in a sense, correlates to this idea of harmony. So we're seeing this fourfold symmetry in action, regardless of the way light is traveling. Now, when we come to the notion of quanta and the Big Bang, essentially, the way I would describe quanta is that it is a bridge mechanism that connects one layer of light to the other. And that bridge mechanism is essentially materializing some information that exists in the layer of light behind it. And in that action, whatever is expressing itself requires a threshold value, in a sense, and that is what quanta is. So it's a bridge mechanism that materializes more subtle information into a further objectified or material form. So when we think about light being projected at 186,000 miles per second, then we can see that really what's might be happening is that when light projects itself at 186,000 miles per second, there's a vast amount of information that is seeking to materialize. And that is the reason why light is projecting itself at that particular speed, because that information is going to show itself in a particular way. But the precipitating event for that information to appear materially can be related to this event that we call the Big Bang. And so the Big Bang can be thought of as a milestone event in which antecedent and subtle information that exists inside light is going to begin to express itself in a particular way in the physical universe, and in fact, create the physical universe and all possibilities inside it. Now, just as we are proposing that there's an intentionality to light traveling at speed c, because that's what's required for materialization and the physical universe to arise in a particular kind of way. what really we're implying here is that if we consider the speed of light to be an upper bound of existence, and if we inverse that, if we take the inverse of that upper bound, we know that c is a big quantity, 186,000 miles per second. If we inverse that, then we reach a very small quantity that I'll propose creates a lower bound of existence and is correlated to this idea of quanta that I had just shared a couple of minutes ago. And these, in a sense, become the bounds of existence. So we have a lower bound that is the inverse of the speed of light, c, and it's called h, or Planck's constant. And then we have the upper bound, which is c, and it's the interaction of these two bounds, h and c, that then cause the physical dynamics or the dynamics of how a particular universe will arise. So in the physical universe, we have a particular value for c and h, and that creates matter in a particular way. But in a cosmology of light, where we could have different constant speeds for light, the quote unquote C and H are going to be progressively different. And I'm going to go into that idea now. So when we think about light, the common scientific notion is that light is a wave particle duality. But what does it really mean, a wave particle duality? You can, in a sense, see that particle is something that requires a particular value of the speed of light, so c, and a particular value of the lower bound h. And that combination, in a sense, creates a particular kind of quanta and expresses itself as a material particle. But if we think about the wave, what we're really saying is that light is existing in a different form of itself, where the speed and the quote unquote h have been altered. So we can hypothesize that the wave is connecting us to an antecedent layer of light where information exists in a different way. And being antecedent, it's going to be much faster than the known speed c, because it's somewhere between c and infinity. But being faster means that if we inverse it, just as we inverse to get h, we're going to get something that's even much, much, much smaller than h. So in a sense, if we think about h as being a binding factor and a particular value of h, or Planck's constant, that exists in the physical universe as necessary to create particles, then if that quote unquote h becomes progressively smaller, then it won't have that binding power to hold that information in a particular way, and it won't show up as a particle, it'll show up as a wave. And so we have this idea of wave particle duality, but that's not the whole of the situation, because if we think about a value where light travels infinitely fast, so the speed of light is infinite, and you inverse that, then essentially you end up with a binding factor of 0, which means that the information in light can't be bound in a particular time and space coordinate, but it'll express itself as 1 throughout all of that layer. Then you get the idea of the block aspect of light. And then somewhere in between, if we have light traveling at some other speed that is between the speed where a wave expresses itself and the block has expressed itself, then we can hypothesize that that speed of light is obviously less than infinity, but way higher than the speed of light that's required to create a wave. And if you inverse that higher speed of light, let's just call it k, or n, we'll just call it n. So you inverse that n, And what you end up with is a quote unquote H that is even less in its ability to bind matter. So that information will show up as a field. So what we're saying is that we have, in effect, a quadrality that's come into place, a block field wave particle quadrality. And this is different than the notion of a wave particle duality. Now, this dynamic that I just went over is really one of what I'd call a triple quantization, and I'll also propose as the basis of a true quantum computation that exists in persistence in the cosmos. So what do I mean? So triple quantization. So we talked about just a minute ago, or I had expressed the idea of that infinity of light traveling infinitely fast, where whatever exists in it by definition is going to be spread across, oneness across that layer of light. And then when light assumes a slightly slower speed, then we can say that that is an intentionality, because there's the four properties that we had identified as presence, power, knowledge, harmony. For that to materialize itself in a physical form would require a triple quantization, meaning that it would have to precipitate or quantize itself thrice in order to become this unique physical universe. But why? Because if we think about these properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that exist when light's traveling infinitely fast, there's an infinity of information in them. And when light is made to project itself at a slightly slower speed to infinity, then we can assume that that information that's hidden in presence or power or knowledge or harmony begins to express itself as a very, very large sets of infinite elements, all related to presence or power or knowledge or harmony. So in a sense, we have the first objectification of this subtle information becoming a little more material and creating four large sets of infinite elements. And then when light projects itself or quantizes itself further, there's another act of quantization that occurs. And that quantization then will further objectify that information in such a way that infinite number of unique elements can be thought of being created, these subtle seeds or elements that could be thought of as unique combinations of elements of these four sets. So you have a large number of subtle seeds that are then created. And then when light projects itself at c, the known speed in this physical universe, then that, or those large infinite number of seeds then become the basis of unique expressions of matter that will express themselves uniquely as matter forms. And we'll go over that in a few minutes. So we can see that just this idea of precipitating information from the infinity of light to a material layer requires a triple quantization. But this is happening persistently. And so the idea is that there's a persistent quantum computation, because we're looking at quantization that's just happening all the time. And so the basis of quantum computation is this idea of information being precipitated from one layer to a more material layer, and this is happening just automatically all the time. But this idea of a persistent quantum computation also then generates the idea, or gives rise to the idea of the origins and possibilities of genetics. Because if we think about any layer of light, And so far we've hypothesized 5 layers. We've said there's a light traveling infinitely fast. There's light traveling at let's say speed n, which is closer to infinity. Then it's traveling at a slower speed k, that's still higher than c, and that the speed k creates a unique infinite number of unique seeds. Then c creates particles, and then we have light projected at 0 that creates a different kind of dark reality. But the fact is that the output of the persistent quantum computation is genetic type information at every step. So when light materializes at this layer of reality where it's traveling at c, by definition, there is a vast amount of genetic type information that is also generated. And this genetic type information becomes more concrete when we get to the layer of the cell that emerges within space-time energy gravity. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But again, each of these 5 layers that we've hypothesized, or that we're saying exist in a cosmology of light, will output a certain kind of genetic type information. And so that's the origins of genetics. But then also it becomes clear that whatever has materialized in this layer where light travels at the fixed speed of c is nothing compared to what still can materialize, because there's infinite amount of information in antecedent layers. And therefore, there's also the possibilities of genetics and genetic type information that can express itself even in different form. Now, it becomes really important to consider this idea of space-time energy gravity in relation to these layers of light that we've just gone over. So when we think about the infinity of unique subtle seeds that exists at that antecedent layer of light that is behind the layer of light where light's traveling at speed c, so that we just call that speed k, then those infinite number of seeds, in a sense, require an arena in which to express themselves when light projects itself at c. And we can think about that as being, that arena as being space. So space fundamentally, in this point of view, has infinite number of unique seeds that are ingrained in it. And time can be thought of the maturation of these seeds to a more material level. And so time is going to be relative. It's going to depend on the particular gradients and dynamics of how a particular seed is beginning to express itself. And so time is that time to maturity in a sense. And energy can be thought of the way in which what is subtle becomes more material. So energy is that particular carrying capacity, if you will, or embryo, which allows this transformation from the subtle to material to take place. And as we can notice around us, that everything has a relationship to everything else. And so it's fair to say that a seed has a relationship with a seed if we're talking about the subtle seeds or even the seeds that animate space. And groups of seeds will have a particular relationship with other groups of seeds. And this correlates with the idea of gravity in a cosmology of light. And so we're saying that space-time energy gravity come into being in a particular way when light projects itself at speed c. And we also, as if you recall, we had said that at speed c, there's that milestone event called the Big Bang that's occurring. And so it's fair to say that when that Big Bang occurs, then space-time energy gravity, as we experience it, set up the macro parameters for the cosmic adventure that we progressively go through. Now, this also gives rise to the idea of the script of genetics. So earlier I had introduced the idea of genetics as being the output of a persistent quantum computation, but we also introduced the idea of space-time energy gravity, which, if we think about it, space being an arena of unique seeds sets up the archetype of what's possible, and so that can be related to knowledge. Time is that notion where essentially the idea that exists in a subtle seed is going to express itself regardless of any kind of circumstance. And so there's implicit the idea of a power. Energy is correlated to the idea of the property of presence and light, and gravity is correlated with the idea of harmony. So we're saying that space-time energy gravity is itself a fourfold expression of the four properties of light that we call essentially knowledge, power, presence, and harmony, that have a one-to-one mapping or correlation with space-time energy and gravity. But the important point is that any kind of seed that materializes, that shows itself, will have these four components to it. Will have the space-time energy gravity, your unique space-time energy gravity script to it, and that I'm also proposing is the basis of genetics. So we have a fourfold script that will accompany any materialization that occurs, and this materialization will by definition be accompanied by a quote-unquote law that defines its space-time energy gravity behavior, and that law is written in the space-time energy gravity script. That's the basis of genetics. And so moving forward, and here I'm skipping a couple of layers, but coming just to give the idea of how in a cosmology of light, whatever emerges is nothing other than light. And we saw that in space-time energy gravity, that is nothing other than presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And when we think about quantum particles, that also is a further emergence in our physical universe. Then we can think of quarks as being a carrier for light's property of knowledge. And I'll explain why in a minute. And we can think of leptons as being a carrier for light's property of power, of bosons as being a carrier for light's property of harmony, and the Higgs boson as being a carrier for light's property of presence. And so here also we have the progressive materialization of light in these four forms. And very quickly, I'll say that if we think about an atom and we go into its nucleus and we think of the atomic number that would uniquely identify the behavior of that atom in the universe, that atomic number is identified or made up by a certain number of protons. But the proton, we know, is made up of just quarks. And so quarks must be a carrier of knowledge from this point of view. Then when we think about leptons and we think about a surrogate for that, the electron, we know that there's essentially the release and binding of electrons is accompanied by a massive release or capture of energy. And so there's a correlation between leptons and the idea of light's property of power. When we think about bosons, we know that they're required for all quantum particles to combine, and therefore that gives us the idea that they are a carrier for light's property of harmony. And then we know that any quantum particle that has mass has to interact with the Higgs field through the Higgs boson, and therefore that gives us the idea that the Higgs boson is a carrier for light's property of presence. But moving ahead, we will find that these quantum particles that then uniquely create 108 known elements, and these elements can also be categorized into four, as S shell, P shell, D shell, and F shell elements. And if we consider the S shell, P shell, D shell, and F shell, we'll see that there's a correlation again with the idea of them being a carrier for particular properties of light. So the S shell, we have elements like hydrogen and helium that we know power suns, and therefore the S shell must be a carrier for light's property of power. If we think about the P shell, we have, for example, elements like carbon and silicon and so on. But there's a vast number of archetypes that show up in the P shell category that are representative of many different kinds of elements. And so it's the idea of the P shell being a carrier for light's property of knowledge. If we think about the D shell, then we have the workhorse elements like iron, nickel, copper, zinc, and so on. And so we know that D shell must be a carrier for light's property of presence. And then when we think about F shell elements, these are the largest elements with the biggest atomic numbers that exist. And so we know that they're experiments in collectivity. And so we have the sense that F shell must be carrier of light's property of harmony. When we think about the next layer of materialization that animates life, then we know that every single living cell has 4 molecular plans in it. And these we call nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides. But if we think about what they stand for, then we know that nucleic acids, for instance, it must be related to being the light's property of knowledge, because nucleic acids create DNA and essentially create libraries of knowledge within each cell. When we think about proteins, they're the workhorse elements in each of the cells. There's up to 30,000 different proteins in the human cell. And so it must be a carrier for the idea of light's property of presence. When we think about lipids, they create natural compartments in cells and create harmony in a cell. And so they must be the carrier of harmony. And polysaccharides are sugars that create energy. And so they must be the carrier of light's property of power. Now, one thing that we'll notice is that just as there's implicit in light these 4 properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony, as that information expresses itself in this universe where light is traveling at speed c, we'll notice that whether we're talking about space-time, energy, gravity, or quantum particles, or atoms, or cells, that these all have 4 components. And these 4 components, as I just expressed, there's a one-to-one mapping with the idea of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And so whatever is implicit in light becomes explicit. And that explicitness, when it combines together to act as one, is what creates stability. And so it can be said that the stability of light-based quadralities, where quadrality is this coming together of 4, is essentially based on the implicit property of 4 expressing itself explicitly and wanting to maintain that relationship or nature of integrality or union in a certain sense, which also is the basis of or an expression of love in a very fundamental form, where the thing that's contained inside light expressing itself as a stability, as a light-based quadrality, is again displaying that implicit secret of light that I would call love. So we talked about several light-based quadralities, space-time, energy, gravity. We talked earlier about past, present, future matter, and then about quantum particles, atoms, cells, and we can also extrapolate or see that human are also light-based quadralities, because if we think about what animates the human, we have essentially your thoughts that are carriers of knowledge. We have sensations that can be the carrier of presence. We have urges and wills that the carrier of power, and then we have emotions that's the carrier of harmony in a sense. So we're seeing that there's a progressive materialization of what it means, of what those things mean, presence, power, knowledge, harmony, because there's a implicit complexification as forms become more and more uh, evolved in a sense. And we can begin to see that culture itself, regardless of where that culture exists, whether in a small organization or in a country, can also be expressed as essentially being anchored in the idea of knowledge or presence and service or power or adventure or harmony, and the many, many, many different elements that are related to knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And so culture, in a sense, is a containing layer or something that emerges where human beings are. And the culture is going to have a very powerful effect on whether that fourfold nature of what's inside light can continue to express itself with more and more sophistication and divergence. And that's going to be dependent on the idea of culture. And then we also get to the notion of each nation being completely unique, but that uniqueness as being an expression of the unique elements of the four sets that are presence, power, knowledge, harmony, and the many, many elements that exist in it. So we can see that again, nation is, in a sense, an expression of a light-based quadrality, which leads us into this idea of complex systems. And here I'll draw your attention to several different layers that exist within a complex adaptive system. So if we think about the human layer, and it's a light-based quadrality, but then as we've already explored, there is a cellular layer that's necessary for the human layer to arise, but that's also a light-based quadrality. And then there's a layer in between that we didn't talk about, the ecosystem services layer, but that also is a light-based quadrality. And then we briefly touched on the ideas of culture and nation. And these form 5 layers. And these 5 layers, essentially, the way that they interact is going to create the complexity of the systems that we live in. And the point being that I would draw a correlation between expansion, contraction dynamics of the cosmos and this idea of a resilient complex adaptive system that's being created with these 5 layers, with the human light-based quadrality in the center. And the idea being that if we think of cosmos as an expression, an adventure of this expression of the information that exists in antecedent layers of light, then we know that so long as nothing interferes with this natural expression of the fourfoldness, then space, by definition, will require more and more seeds for that information to express itself. And so we can say that the universe will expand. But on the flip side, if something goes wrong with the complex adaptive system that's made up of those 5 layers, so, for example, if there's complete acidity at the cellular level, or ecosystem services stop working, or the human becomes very fragmented and seeks only selfish aims rather than the fourfoldness, the possibilities of fourfoldness, and if culture doesn't reinforce the possibilities of fourfoldness, and also if nations don't delve into their uniqueness to again become that unique expression of what's possible with fourfoldness, and create the macro structure for all the other layers to express themselves. If none of that happens, then essentially in this point of view, in this cosmology of light point of view, the essential adventure by which fourfoldness is trying to express more of itself can't happen anymore. And so the object of that cosmos can't be maintained, and so there would be a contraction, and that would lead to perhaps what some people would call a pralaya. Now, there are a couple of more concepts I just want to draw on before concluding. One is the precision of cosmic computational power. So, what we're saying essentially is that in this vast adventure, from these four properties that exist at light's native state, you can see that through the precipitation of layers of light and then through the macro container of space-time, energy, gravity, there is essentially a vast amount of computational power, quantum computational power, that is persistently acting to allow that fourfoldness to express itself in more and more complete and full forms. And so, here we have this idea of the space-time, energy, gravity going to layers of physical reality with quantum particles, and then progressively with atoms, and then with cells, and then onto human beings. But one can see the chain of this intentional or precise computational power that had to exist for all of this to happen, which gets us to the final point about the idea of a light-based quadrality, or singularity rather. When we think about the human being is at the crux of things from several points of view. So even if we think about the human being just physically, then the order of magnitudes that exist from the lowest levels of cosmos, or the smallest level of cosmos, down to quantum levels, and then to the largest levels in parsecs of the extent of the universe, we find that the human being is conveniently at the center. And in a cosmology of light, again, this would be intentional, because the way that the human being really chooses to act or chooses to perceive, or whether the human being really follows a call to the adventure of this expression of fourfoldness and allows the fourfoldness to continue to express itself, such that the human being evolves into something that we may call a light-based singularity, where there's a knowledge of the oneness of the human, or this form that's evolved from the human, with the nature of light itself. So up to the human being, the interesting thing was that we can say that cosmic computation proceeded in an almost automatic way. It was implicit in the way the cosmos interacts or acts. But with the surfacing of the human, cosmic computation is now, in a sense, delegated to the human being. And the way the human being chooses to act is going to define what remains possible, or what can be possible, with the possibility that there shall be the emergence of light-based singularity, where the consciousness that's embodied in the form that evolves from the human form is completely one with everything else. And so that brings us to the end of this idea of cosmology of light. And just to summarize, it's essentially this adventure that led us from the native state where light travels infinitely fast to light projecting more and more of its possibility, such that it may culminate in this thing that we call a light-based singularity.